Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and I wanted to sort of come back to the alternate reality I discussed in one of my more recent videos, wherein I talked about what might have happened had director Tobe Hooper had a more fruitful collaboration with the Conan group. And so I'm not wanting to focus on that particular aspect in this video, but I am wanting to talk about that particular version of the Conan group. And I'll definitely leave a link to that particular video in the description for this one. So one of the key differences between the Conan group in this alternate reality versus our reality is that, unlike in real life, this particular version of the Conan group was able to maintain a form of financial stability. So while they did still predominantly turn out B movies, they were stable enough to where they were able to take some chances, financially speaking. And so their collaboration with Tobe Hooper would end up being much more successful, than it was in our reality. And so this would in turn, pave the way for them to take some more chances some more artistic risks. But since they're in much better standing in terms of, say, finances, as well as from a critical standpoint, I think this would be a point where they'd feel more confident in, say, taking a shot at doing a Captain America trilogy. And so in real life, there was a Captain America movie around, I believe it was 1990, that was directed by Albert Pune. And while it wasn't a Conan group movie, there was a connection to the Conan group in the sense that one of the producers was in fact one of the movers and shakers of the Conan group, or former Conan group, because the cousins that were basically in charge of the Conan group, Menahem Golem and Yoram Globus, towards the end of that particular company, they had a falling out, and so they went their separate ways and made their own production companies. And so the production company that one of them was in charge of was the company that put out the Captain America movie that was directed by Albert Pune. And so that particular movie has gone down as one of the worst superhero movies ever made. And I've seen it a couple of times when I was younger, and I've seen clips from it when I was older. And so there are some things where it's kind of like they stand out as promising moments in an otherwise lousy movie. But Albert Pune, who sadly passed away not that long ago, lamented that one of his biggest regrets was that no one got to see his version of the movie. And so you come to find out that there was a more or less a rough cut of the movie that was his version of the movie. I mean, we're talking like a different sequence of events, a different soundtrack. And if you look it up on YouTube, I mean, you can find some stuff about it. And there's this one guy who wrote this whole book about Albert Pune's career, and one of the things he talks about obviously is Captain America. But apparently that particular writer and Albert Pune kind of became friends, and Albert Pune let him see his version of the movie. As I believe he sent him a copy of the movie, I think is what it was. But this guy in his video, he was talking about it and saying that, dude, I mean, this was actually a good movie. Now, since I haven't seen it, I can't say it was a good movie or not, but it definitely sounds a lot better than what we ended up getting in the theater, or say, what we ended up getting on screen. And it's kind of it's a sad thing, really, because I mean, Albert Pune is one of those directors who he had a lot of potential, and when he was on, you definitely saw a rather distinctive director. I mean, albeit one that was almost exclusive to the B-movie scene. But even then, though, when he was on his game, there was a certain, style that he had. And so, but unfortunately, a good portion of, his efforts were kind of like an uphill battle. And Captain America was definitely one of those points. And when it was taken out of his hands and reshot by the studio, we ended up getting what we got, which was a lousy, comic book movie. So the fact that there is a version of Captain America that we haven't seen, when I say we, I mean the majority of the movie-going public, I mean, it feels like we've been cheated, because this whole time, we're thinking that, oh man, Albert Pion, I mean, he had so much potential, but then, Captain America was, definitely a blunder that he never really recovered from. I mean, yeah, he still did a lot of work, but, after that, he didn't really seem to be able to get anything in the way of, say, an A-level movie or anything like that. And so the fact that there's this version of the movie floating around that we haven't seen, that only a few people have, and that they're all saying that, dude, this movie would have gotten a much better reception if, this had been the version that was shown, And I did, the gentleman who wrote that book about Albert Pion, the one who was able to get a copy of the movie, he was able to show a clip from the movie to sort of compare, like what was in Albert Pion's version versus what was in, the version that we got. And one of the things that I noticed was that the soundtrack is definitely better. So anyway, though, yeah, so there was a Captain America movie that, even though it wasn't made, by the Canon Group, there was a Canon Group connection, amongst other things. Albert Pion did, a few films for them. Dangerously Close, Cyborg, Alien from LA, which Alien from LA was a pretty lousy movie if you ask me, but Dangerously Close and Cyborg were actually pretty cool. But coming back to this alternate reality, though, okay, so this is going to be a totally different movie, or I should say a different series of movies, because we're talking about a trilogy here. And so considering that this is a version of the Canon Group that was able to maintain its financial stability, as well as, say, a better sense of marketing or promotion, and they've had more than a few successes on their hands, especially with their collaboration with Tobe Hooper. I'm thinking in this particular, reality, we would get a trilogy that was directed by John Milius, the guy who gave us Conan the Barbarian, Red Dawn, The Big Wednesday, and co-written by Oliver Stone. Now, these two guys did work together on Conan the Barbarian, but Oliver Stone had a screenplay that, by the accounts of those who have read the screenplay, was rather epic. I mean, we're talking like, say, epic enough, for, 3 movies, but being crammed into one. And so John Milius basically came in and rewrote the screenplay to where it'd be more manageable and filmable. And, I think this is, something that resulted in a better outcome, because, what we got was the classic that was Conan the Barbarian, which was definitely one of the best fantasy films of the 80s for sure. And while that particular film is definitely more of a John Milius film than an Oliver Stone film, Oliver Stone's fingerprint isn't altogether absent, because if you look at films of his such as, say, Salvador or Platoon, or even, say, Year of the Dragon, which he didn't direct but he wrote the screenplay for, there's definitely, a cynicism, and distrust, for those in authority and those in power. But on the other hand, the tale of a man, trying to make his way in a harsh world and, becoming a self-made legend, that's definitely more of a John Milius thing. And so in this alternate reality, I'd like to think that their collaboration would be more, shall we say, more of a there'd be more visibility on Oliver Stone's part. It'd still be more of a Milius movie than a Stone movie, but Oliver Stone would have more visibility in terms of, say, what he was able to bring to the table. And also, I'd like to think that in this alternate reality, the cocaine problem that he had, say, in the early 80s is something that, he was able to get clean from around this point in time, to where it's like, okay, it definitely left a mark on him, and he's definitely got some demons, but, but he's able to get some help, and, he was able to channel that darkness. And so we would be, as a result, getting, a comic book trilogy or a comic book movie series that, had some fantastical elements, but some, hard-hitting stuff as well, especially in terms of, say, like the nature of warfare, or, the corruption of, those in authority. And so I think for the score, I mean, once again, we're going to Conan the Barbarian. Basil Palladorius would be perfect for it, because he turned out an iconic score for Conan the Barbarian, but he also did the score for films like RoboCop and Starship Troopers, but he also did the score for John Milius' own Red Dawn. And so Red Dawn being a Cold War paranoia war movie, I mean, that's something that, if we're talking like, say, 1984, it'd be a fascinating choice for John Milius to direct Captain America, because this would be like the first entry in the trilogy, would be coming out, say, like the same year as Red Dawn. But I think Red Dawn would come out first, but so you'd have that Conan the Barbarian connection, in the sense that all three guys worked on Conan the Barbarian, but we'd have something to where Basil Palladorius would still turn out, an awesome score, something that was appropriate for, a World War II era, set of movies, because I think that the first two movies would definitely take place in World War II, and the third movie would take place in the then present of the 1980s. And so I think he'd be able to give us a score that was suitable for, both decades, like the decade of World War II as well as the decade of the 80s, but also still having a suitable score for Captain America himself. But speaking of Captain America, the person I'm thinking of to play Steve Rogers would be Kurt Russell, because this was a point in time where he was certainly well known amongst the public for being in several Disney movies, but he also showed that he could play darker roles, such as his characters from Escape from New York or The Thing, Snake Plissken in Escape from New York, and R.J. McCready in The Thing. And so this would be a point in time where Kurt Russell was someone who showed that he could play someone who has a sort of boyish charm, but also a suspicious and cynical edge to him, like a dark edge. And I think that him playing Captain America would be a fascinating choice, because he'd be playing Steve Rogers as someone who is an idealistic man who wants to serve his country. And so there'd be a lot of hope and optimism initially, but as the trilogy goes on, or especially as the first two movies go on, he's confronted with the fact that not only is war hell, but while he's fighting monsters in the form of the Nazi regime, he's having to confront the fact that America has certain agents in their party who aren't altogether altruistic, and so having Steve Rogers confront something like that would definitely be something that would add some cynicism to his character. But at the same time, he'd still be trying to maintain the ideal of being a hero and representing America at its best. And I think that's where, John Milius and Oliver Stone, there'd be some creative, frisson between the two of them, but they'd be able to make it work in the film's favor because, John Milius is definitely more of a hawk, whereas Oliver Stone is, definitely on the opposite side of things from a political standpoint. But I think both of them would bring enough experience to the table to where they'd make something that, celebrates, the myth making of Captain America, or, the forging of another legend, albeit, one that's, tempered by the harsh reality of warfare. And so I think that in this first entry, of course, it would focus on Steve Rogers volunteering. I mean, we'd get to know Steve Rogers and, how, he volunteers for the super soldier, serum in order to serve his country, and then becomes Captain America. And going from there, I think that, of course, he would, meet Bucky, who I think would be played by Christian Slater, because this is a point in time where Christian Slater was kind of a rising young actor and was definitely perfect for playing someone who was a bit rebellious or cocky. And so having Christian Slater as Bucky working with Kurt Russell as Steve Rogers, I think would be a bit of good casting, because I imagine they'd have some good chemistry with each other. And then I think that for some supporting characters, maybe Alice Krige as Sharon Carter. Alice Krige, of course, at this point in time, was well known for her parts in, the films Chariots of Fire and Ghost Story. And so, and to most audiences today, she's known as the Borg Queen. But I mean, back in the early 80s, yeah, I mean, I think that she's someone that, was very beautiful, but was someone who, was able to project a sort of, strength that, would be believable for a character like Sharon Carter. Or confidence, I think, would probably be a better choice of words than strength, because that sounds too broad. But on the other hand, though, we'd also have Nick Fury or Sergeant Nick Fury in the Howling Commandos. And so I confess that I'm not too familiar with the characters of the Howling Commandos, in terms of, say, I wouldn't be able to tell you who all of them are. But I think that for the character of Nick Fury in particular, Mickey Rourke, okay, because if this is, say, 1984, 85, I mean, this would be Mickey Rourke from Body Heat, The Pope of Greenwich Village, Year of the Dragon. I mean, this is a guy who has a sort of, grimy edge to him, and both visually and from a sort of, acting, standpoint as well. But I think, he also was able to, believably play someone who has, a certain sense of authority. I mean, whether it be, street level authority, like in, say, the Pope of Greenwich Village, or, say, a morally gray area, like in the area of, say, crime, which was also in the Pope of Greenwich Village, but also Body Heat, where he plays the arsonist. But then again, you look at his role in Year of the Dragon, where he plays Police Captain Stanley White. I mean, that was definitely a part that was written for an older, person, but Mickey Rourke was able to make it work, and he had this sort of old soul, rough charisma to him, to where he was able to believably play, a figure of authority in a war-torn area, and so you take that Mickey Rourke and put him in the spot of, Sergeant Nick Fury. I think we'd have a pretty badass Nick Fury, a very believable one as well, because this would be a Nick Fury who is, a seasoned veteran, and who realizes that you can't win war with clean hands. And so, this is where a lot of the morally gray area would come into play. Like, Nick Fury is still on the side of good, to be sure, as well as are the Howling Commandos, but we definitely see that, yeah, you have to get your hands dirty to win, unfortunately. And this would be kind of a learning experience for Captain America and Bucky. I think for the character of Dum Dum Dugan, though, while he was well played by Neil McDonough in Captain America: The First Avenger, I think since it's the 80s, I think that a good choice would be James Cosmo, who was, at this point in time, he was in the film Highlander. I want to say his name was Angus, but don't quote me. But basically, he was like one of the few villagers of Connor McLeod's, one of the few people in Connor McLeod's village who wasn't wanting to burn him or, kill him when he didn't die from his wound and was revealed to be an immortal, But you look at James Cosmo, in that movie, and then you look at the character of Dum Dum Dugan, and I think James Cosmo, physically speaking, as well as from a personality standpoint, would be a good choice for the character of Dum Dum Dugan. And also, if I remember correctly, there was a private named Gabriel Jones. I want to say that's his name, but one of the things that stood out about him was that he played the trumpet, and so I think that since this is a Canon Group movie and this is like, say, 1984 or 85, I would think that a choice of casting for him would be the actor who played the character of Turbo from the movie Breakin'. Michael, I think his name was Michael Chambers, I think is his name. But he, I think, would be a good choice for the character of Gabriel Jones. Because, one, there's already some, visibility with him as an actor, with him having been in Breakin', which, was one of the Canon Group's, most well-known movies and one of their most successful ones as well. And so you'd already have, some credibility there. And then the fact that this particular, actor is playing that particular character, he'd be able to probably, bring something to the part that, was visible in Breakin', but then, sort of channel it through the perspective of World War II. So, in regards to who the villain for this first chapter would be, I'm thinking it would be someone like, say, Baron Zemo. Okay, and this wouldn't be a pretty boy Baron Zemo. No offense to the guy who played Zemo in the MCU. He's a good actor, but the Baron Zemo of World War II was someone who was hideously scarred, and he constantly wore this mask that had some regality to it. But he was an evil son of a bitch. Okay, but I think that the perfect choice to play Baron Zemo would be Richard Lynch, okay? Because Richard Lynch, from like, say, the late 70s to the early 80s was phenomenal at playing villainous characters. And one of the things that worked in his favor, aside from the fact that he was a good actor, was the fact that he had a horribly, scarred visage. Well, I shouldn't say horribly scarred, but he did have a scarred visage because when he was at one point he had set himself on fire while under the influence of drugs. And so, you look at him and you're like, okay, this guy's been through some shit, but he looked scary though. And he made it work to his advantage. And, you look at him in movies like, say, The Premonition or The Sword and the Sorcerer, Cut and Run. And he was really good in those parts, or his parts in those movies, I should say. And then, coming back to the Canon Group, he was in a Canon Group movie, which was 1985's Invasion USA, which had Chuck Norris in it. And with respect to Chuck Norris, Invasion USA was honestly not that good of a movie. I guess you could say it was so bad it's good. I mean, depending on your perspective, but I will say though that while the movie itself wasn't that good, Richard Lynch was actually pretty good in it, and he played a good villain. It's just the movie he was in sucked. Unless we're going with, over the top, so bad it's good, charm, but that would be, say, another Canon Group connection in this alternate reality. So, because, I mean, I imagine Invasion USA would still be made, but I'd like to think that maybe it'd be a better movie, But Richard Lynch, who already has a reputation for playing villainous characters, I think would be a good choice for the character of Baron Zemo. Because, if you look at him in the movie The Sword and the Sorcerer, while I'm not going to say that's a quote-unquote good movie, I will say it's a decent one. But Richard Lynch was definitely one of the good things about the movie, because he believably played a sort of aristocratic character who, was basically, he reminded me in some ways of Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones, but I think a more haunted Tywin Lannister, because this was a guy who had, stabbed a lot of people in the back to get to the top, and, he was haunted by his actions in the sense that he knew that there was some part of him knew that he was due for a reckoning, and but at the same time though, in order to stave off this reckoning, I mean, he didn't care who he had to kill, or he didn't care who he had to step on in order to get to the top, because if he was able to get to the top and stay on top, then basically he had power overall, philosophically speaking. And so, having an actor who can play that kind of character, playing someone like Baron Zemo, I mean, I think Richard Lynch would do a good job in the part, because he'd be able to play, Baron Zemo as a psychotic madman, albeit, one who was a figure of authority and was a genuine threat, and, he might seem like a raving madman at times, and probably because in some ways he is, but, there was a, cunning to his character. And so, I mean, you don't get to be, Baron Zemo without being cunning, and Richard Lynch, I think, would do a good job of playing, that type of cunning, as well as madness. And I imagine that, one of the things that might come up in the story is when, Captain America and Bucky and Fury and the Commandos, I mean, at one point, I imagine they'd come across, some of Baron Zemo's, experiments involving POWs or something like that. And this would be, body horror, like 80s body horror in a World War II movie. And, it would show, just how depraved the Nazis are. But then also, this would be where, okay, the Allies, while they were definitely, the ones you wanted to win the war, they weren't always they weren't always squeaky clean. And for example, I mean, you have, Allies, profiting from, technology that was developed by, the Nazis, in real life, for one. But you could touch on that by, say, having, Captain America, having orders to retrieve, some of the technology of Baron Zemo, or the notes of Baron Zemo, on certain experimentations, to give to the Allied scientists. And this would be something where when they see just how horrifying the experiments are, this is where they're like, no, we're not going to give you this demonic shit here. Something along those lines. But put much more well, I shouldn't say delicately, but put much more believably, than what I just said. But from the pen of Oliver Stone, as well as John Milius as well. So I think like that would be like the first movie, right? So Baron Zemo is the main, like Captain America, Steve Rogers becoming Captain America, getting to know and work with Bucky, and then the two of them, getting to know and work with Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos, and then going up against, Richard Lynch as Baron Zemo, who he would just be terrifying, I think. And then, of course, I think, having, Nick Fury lose one of his eyes, at the climax of the movie, I mean, that would be like, okay, this is where he gets his eye patch. And so going forward into the second movie, Mickey Rourke, wears an eye patch, and he's like, okay, he is definitely Nick Fury, So going into the second movie, this is where, things I think would get more fantastical. I mean, you'd still have, the whole aspect of war is hell. I mean, this is still a John Milius and Oliver Stone joint, with a pretty awesome score by Basil Palladorius. But this would be where, okay, Captain America, or Steve Rogers, has become a seasoned veteran at this point. And while he's not as, say, cynical as Nick Fury is, he does have some cynicism to him, what with what he's seen and, some of the horrors that he's, experienced during war. And of course with Bucky, I mean, he's still a bit rebellious and everything, but this would be like a coming of age story for him too, So both of these guys are changed individuals when we get to, part 2. But this is where we get more of a comic book feel, because the villain would be the Red Skull, okay? And Red Skull, I think, would be played by Jürgen Prochnow. I hope I'm saying his name right, but he's a German actor who was arguably best known for playing the U-boat captain in the movie, the fantastic World War II movie, Das Boot. And so it's from the perspective of a German U-boat crew. And if you like World War II movies, definitely check out Das Boot. But Jürgen Prochnow, so it might be a bit of typecasting in a sense that you have a German playing a notorious Nazi comic book villain, which is Red Skull, right? But I think that he would be perfect for the part, because he's also good at playing both good characters and evil characters. And I think that having him play the Red Skull would be an inspired touch. And I don't know who would be doing the makeup, but this being the early 80s, maybe someone along the lines of Rick Baker or Carlo Rambaldi, or maybe some of the people who did the makeup and special effects in the movie Life Force. I mean, but there are all sorts of people you could do who could have done the makeup and special effects to create the Red Skull, or to help Jürgen Prochnow bring the Red Skull to life. But you would also have the introduction of the Invaders, okay? And the Invaders were a World War II, super team that fought the Nazis in Marvel Comics. And one of the things that, might be cool is if, say, like in part 1, there were references to the Invaders, but you never saw them, okay? But you heard about them. But so far, the only, superhuman, fighting for the Allies that we see is Captain America, okay? But then going into the second movie, so you'd have Nick Fury coming back with the surviving commandos, but then they team up with the Invaders to, take on the Red Skull and probably attack his compound or castle or something along those lines. And so for the Invaders, okay, this is where I think we could get some inspired casting, okay? So I'm thinking, for the Human Torch, okay, the original Human Torch, who was an android, I'm thinking someone like John Voight, who, was in, the Canon movie Runaway Train, which is a fantastic movie and is arguably, the best movie to come out of the Canon group. To be fair, I still need to see Love Streams, but of the Canon group movies I've seen, Runaway Train is definitely the best, and John Voight was fantastic in it. In fact, he was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor for that movie. He didn't win, but he was nominated, and deservedly so. And so having John Voight, who had already been in a war, in a movie involving, the trauma of war, the movie Coming Home from the late 70s, very, very sad movie. I mean, or I should say, it's definitely some depressing subject matter, to be sure. But he played a partially, paralyzed soldier. He was paralyzed from the waist down, if I remember correctly. But he was wonderful in the part. And I've seen parts of the movie, and the parts I've saw though I really liked, and so I need to see the rest of it. But John Voight was great in that. And so you have the John Voight who, at this point in his career, was in Coming Home and Runaway Train, as well as Deliverance, okay? He would be a fascinating casting choice for the Human Torch because he's playing a character who looks human, but he's an android. He's a robot that's designed to look human, but he does have a soul, a personality, and so you'd have a character sort of, trying to hang on to a semblance of humanity, even though they're not human. They're made to look human, but they're not human. And then, of course, you have the whole thing about, being able to burst into flames and fly. But he, as the Human Torch, would be a good choice. And maybe he could play someone who, he's been at war, and he's also, fought other superpowered, characters. And, basically, I mean, he's kind of a seasoned veteran himself, albeit in a different way, from, say, Captain America. Because Captain America is more, say, hands-on, human, albeit one who is a superhuman due to the super soldier serum. But, he's more, flesh and blood. Whereas Human Torch would be, he's called Human Torch, but he's not exactly human, though. But he's, grappling with his feeling of humanity while also, fighting against the Nazis and trying to watch the backs of his teammates. And so, he'd probably have some cynicism, too, when it comes to, say, war and demands and humanity demand, but he'd recognize that, fighting for the Allies is definitely the better alternative than, say, letting the Nazis win. And him and Captain America would probably have some interesting conversations, and he'd probably try to pass on some advice as far as, say, what it's like, not being the human, you once were, or the human you wanted to be, in a world that, is changing at such a fast pace. I mean, you got all this technology coming out and all these, people with powers emerging and things like that. So he'd be able to give Captain America, some interesting perspective, and Captain America in turn would be the person who, one of the people who kind of helps him to hold on to his humanity by basically, fighting in a hellish environment, but still striving to be, the ideal, representation of America, or just of humanity, if you will. Now, for Namor the Submariner, okay, I'm thinking Sho Kozuki, because Sho Kozuki also, was in one of the Canon Group's more successful films, so Revenge of the Ninja. He was also in a couple other films for the Canon Group, but Revenge of the Ninja is probably his best one. And having Sho Kozuki play Namor the Submariner, some people might be like, oh, that's stereotyping because he was Japanese, and and he's playing a mutant fighting Nazis in World War II or something like that. But it could work though, because Sho Kosugi would bring, raw physicality to his part, whether it be in the way he carries himself or the way he handles himself in fight scenes. And you'd have Namor the Submariner being able to pull off some fantastic, fight scenes with Sho Kosugi's martial arts abilities. And, you could also, maybe with Smoke and Mirrors, have it to where Sho Kosugi is made to, say, be strong enough to, lift up a tank or something like that, or to fly and charge into enemy airplanes or something like that, with some good camera work, some good smoke and mirrors. I mean, I think Sho Kosugi would be like a primal beast unleashed as Namor the Submariner. I mean, he'd be regal, like when he's carrying himself in the social scenes and what have you, albeit one who's sort of standoffish because he doesn't trust humanity, and also he had clashed with the Human Torch, but the two of them have come to an understanding and are willing to work together to fight the Nazis, but he's not quite so willing to reveal all his cards, to his allies, because they're humans and he's not. But then as the movie goes on, you'd see him start to open up and become more protective of his allies. And so when the fight scenes happen, that's when you see Namor unleashed, and that's where you would see Sho Kosugi, going all out with his martial arts, abilities, and you'd have some good, with some good fight scene choreographers. I think we'd get a very memorable Namor the Submariner, what with Sho Kosugi's presence, as well as his fighting abilities or his martial arts abilities. So two other characters I could think of, as far as the invaders go, because this is still early 80s, okay? I'm not sure how they would do the special effects for the Human Torch. I mean, I still want to keep John Voight as the Human Torch in this alternate reality for this second Captain America movie, but I don't know how they would do the pyrotechnic effects. That would be the trick. So even if the Canon Group is more financially stable and able to throw some more money at their movies, or at some of their movies, this being one of them, I'm not sure how they would do the pyrotechnic effects, because the Human Torch is able to set himself on fire or just to light up, and you'd have to show that. You'd have to sort of be convincing about it, albeit from the perspective of an early 80s comic book movie. So that part I don't have expertise on. I mean, I don't really have expertise on any of this, but the casting's more, I guess, where I'm more confident in. But in terms of this alternate reality, but somehow though, I think they'd be able to pull it off as far as special effects go. Okay, so there's two other characters I could think of that they might be able to have on screen in such a way towards like, okay, this is early 80s, but the actors are good enough in the parts to where it's like, okay, we can forgive if the special effects aren't, say, exactly like we think about in a comic book or something like that. There was a character I don't know a whole lot about named Miss America, who was one of the invaders, but having her on the screen, there'd be an interesting dynamic, because I mean, you'd have her, and then you'd have Sharon Carter, who would probably be in a more supporting capacity at this point than, say, a more active participant in the conflict that she was in, say, part 1. But Miss America, though, since she's one of the invaders and has superpowers like super strength and what have you, I think that having her on the team would be a good choice. And so I think someone like Carrie Lowell, because this second part would be around like 1986, 1987, and Carrie Lowell had been in the movie Dangerously Close, which was a pretty good Albert Peon movie that was done for the Cannon Group. And the character she played in that movie was someone who was vulnerable, but wasn't. But when she was pushed to the wall, she fought back. That kind of thing. But she did have vulnerability to her, but then you look at her in the Timothy Dalton James Bond movie License to Kill, and she was a pretty badass Bond girl in that, and she was able to handle herself in a fight scene. The character was, but Carrie Lowell was as well. I mean, from terms of fight choreography. So having someone like her play Miss America, I think, would be an interesting choice, because be someone who is young and maybe a bit unsure of themselves, but at the same time, they know they can handle themselves in a fight, except this time, they're, fighting in a genuine war. But since she's part of the invaders, it's possible that this isn't her first rodeo. Like, she's fought Nazis before, but this particular mission is something different, And so last but not least, okay, I was trying to think about this, and I came up with, they'd be able to pull off, having the character, the Wizard, be on the team of the invaders, because he was on the team, to be fair, he was one of the key members of the invaders, but having him on screen would be the trick, because once again, I'm not sure exactly how they do the special effects to show his super speed, because he is a speedster, so to speak. But for the casting, though, I think someone like Ian Charleson would be a fantastic choice, because Ian Charleson was a very versatile actor. I mean, on one hand, he played a, sort of gay, bisexual, a punk, in a punk rocker almost, or street punk in Derek Jarman's movie Jubilee. But then, he played a Christian athlete in the movie Chariots of Fire, which is a great movie, and he was fantastic in that. And it's like you see him in those two roles, and it's like, well, it's night and day. I mean, the guy was pretty versatile. But also, going back to Chariots of Fire, he's someone who could definitely sell an athlete's strength, okay, because he was a runner in that movie. And if they were able to bring that over into this character, I mean, the sincerity they had in Chariots of Fire, you'd have someone who was a morally upright person, who was having to fight in a hellish environment against evil forces, and some of the people he's working with are of morally gray nature, but you'd have him trying to remind them that they're on the side of good, and basically trying to keep everyone grounded. Well, it's like, yes, we're fighting in this nightmarish war, but we can't let this war turn us into the monsters that we're fighting. Like, we fight out of necessity, but we cannot let their nature turn us into something that we would be ashamed of. But he's willing to also carry the burden that comes with fighting in war. But he's more fortunate than others in the sense that he's a speedster, but he's not a coward by any means or anything like that. And he's willing to get his hands dirty as well, but at the same time, with the knowledge that in doing so, he's fighting to keep an evil from taking over the world, literally. And so I think having Ian Charleson as the Wizard would be a wonderful casting choice, especially just based on his performance in Chariots of Fire. So yeah, I think like that second movie, I mean, the climax of it would be, of course, they face off with the Red Skull, and in the process, of course, Bucky loses his life, and Captain America falls into the sea, and ends up in suspended animation, and that would be where the second movie would end. Okay, and so Kurt Russell, Steve Rogers, falls into the ocean and is frozen. So going into the third movie, though, okay, this would be where Captain America is revived in the modern day, which would be 1980s. So I think this being 1987 and 1988, around the time Oliver Stone had done, Wall Street. I mean, this would be where he would have, a stronger mark on the movie than he did, say, in the first two movies. Like, granted, I mean, he still would, have a lot to do with, the first two movies. But here, though, we're talking like, say, Captain America, a relic from World War II, waking up in, the modern day 80s, wherein, greed is good was the modern mentality. Excuse me. And I think that having, Steve Rogers, trying, come to terms with, this being the America, this America being something different from the America that he grew up in, and also, questioning, is this the America that I fought for, that, some of my friends died for, and, because basically, he would see, like, the glimpse of corruption that he got in World War II from, some of his own allies, like those in power, those with ulterior motives, from his perspective, they were in the minority. They were present, but they were a minority. There were still good people in power as well. But him waking up in the 80s and seeing, how corrupt things are, it'd be like that minority is now the majority. The majority consists of, people who, care more about money than, say, the well-being of, the country, or I should say the citizens, the people of the country. And so I think the villain of this movie would be someone like Flag Smasher, who was basically, an anarchist, and that was his whole thing. I mean, and having him, cast or in a light where he, was basically rebelling against capitalism, but this being written by Oliver Stone, he'd probably be a character who would have some, points that the audience would find rather valid, except, him, coming at things from a terrorist perspective, like he was an anarchist, terrorist. I mean, it'd be like, this guy's a threat, but at the same time, he's not entirely wrong, And I think that, the actor that I would cast in the part of Flag Smasher would be someone like Eric Roberts. In this being 80s and the Cannon Group, Eric Roberts was in the movie Runaway Train, and he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor in that movie, and he did really good as well, alongside Jon Voight. But he was also in a movie called Star 80, which was about a playmate named Dorothy Stratton, who was on top, found herself on top of the world, and then ended up being murdered by the man who discovered her, groomed her, and loved her, and couldn't handle it when he, couldn't hold on to her anymore when she basically sailed past his orbit. And he played a guy named Paul Schneider, who was the guy who murdered Dorothy Stratton, and he was someone who at times had a certain relatable humanity in the part, but then other times he'd be straight up terrifying. And so having Eric Roberts, channel some of that into the role of Flag Smasher, you'd have a charismatic villain, I think. Plus the fact that he was nominated for his part in Runaway Train, albeit for a different type of performance entirely, where he was basically kind of a mentally challenged, inmate almost, or dim-witted inmate, if you will. But Eric Roberts, also, of course, we've seen him in movies like The Expendables and The Dark Knight, where, yeah, he's definitely good at playing bad guys, but being able to bring the intensity that he had in Star 80 into the part of Flag Smasher, you'd have, and plus, the, almost likable villainy that he had in, The Dark Knight, where he was the head mobster dude, and then of course in The Expendables as well, where it's like you love to hate him, but he did have a certain bad guy charm to him. He would be a good choice as Flag Smasher if we're talking like the 80s, I think. And he would be a good opponent for Captain America, because Captain America, of course, is a symbol of capitalism, and Flag Smasher is a symbol of anarchy. But then you have Captain America being conflicted about being the symbol for capitalism, especially when he sees what capitalism has led to. This being cutthroat 1980s, greed is good, and war on drugs and shit like that. And that's where that in particular, the war on drugs, I think would be a fascinating talking point, because then you'd have like, that'd be a good way to say, examine, some of the, social inequalities that still plagued America, and arguably still do to this day, about, oppressed minorities and things like that, people, who aren't white, who are getting harsher penalties, for drugs and or drug possessions and things like that, all sorts of stuff. But then I think, having the character of Falcon being brought in, and so this is where we would go with another, person who had been one of the, hits of the Canon group. Once again, we're going back to the movie Break-In. And I'm thinking, the late actor, Adolfo Quinones, who played, Ozone in the movie Break-In. And I think, this being, the 80s, and plus the fact that he was a dance choreographer as well in real life, he, I think, would be able to bring a certain, grace, to the character of Falcon, from a physical standpoint. Like, he'd be able to maybe sell, the combat scenes, but also, depending on how they're able to show his character flying, he could do something with his, physicality, to convey, basically like, he's been able to, mold his body to, almost bird-like aesthetic when flying or something like that. But also the street level grit that he brought to his character in, Break-In, I think he'd be able to bring to, say, the character of, Falcon in this, Captain America movie. And basically, while Steve Rogers is, shaken and trying to come to terms with what America has become, he meets Falcon, and he kind of, helps him out, helps him get caught up to speed, but also showing him around, saying, hey, this is what things are, man, and what are you going to do about it? And so then, of course, having the two of them, trying to, right some of the, social wrongs, so, I guess, locally, depending on where they are, probably New York City, and then going up against Flag Smasher, and, then you'd have that conflict of, okay, Falcon was able to school Steve Rogers on what America has become, and, Steve Rogers is now having to contend with a villain who, is wanting to destroy capitalism, but not just capitalism, but just, any sort of, stability, that, the world has right now. And so you'd have to have Captain America, fighting for a system that he doesn't necessarily believe in anymore, but he's not fighting for the system. He's fighting for the people that the system let down. And so then, you'd have, Steve Rogers, emerge as a radically, transformed individual, to where he's like, okay, you as in, the American government want me to play ball with you guys. We're going to make some changes, and he would have the authority to back it up, because I think one of the things that, you could have happen is, Nick Fury would come back, and this would still be Mickey Rourke, but it'd be like kind of like a cameo almost, or it'd be a brief part, and this would be Nick Fury, after he had this formula. Like in the comics, there was a formula he had that sort of slowed down his aging, I believe. So even though he's been around since World War II, he doesn't look like it, but I think that there'd be some makeup involved, because you don't want, it's like, this is a comic book movie, but you don't want things to get too far, out of left field, so maybe just have Mickey Rourke with some makeup to make him look older or something like that. So it's like, you'd have Captain America, after he and Falcon have fought against Flag Smasher and his forces and won, and then, like the American government's wanting, Steve Rogers to, be a good boy for them. And that's where he takes a stand and says, no, if you want me to play ball, we're going to make some changes. And they're like, oh yeah, you in what army? And that's when Nick Fury, who is now head of S.H.I.E.L.D., would chime in and say, yeah, guys, about that army. And then and Steve Rogers would be like, have a bit of a reunion there. And then, he's like, all right, guys, whenever you're ready. As in, he'd have Captain America's back and Falcon's back and be ready to, face whatever came, And so, just as far as rough ideas go, I think this is how, the trilogy would go if, we had in this alternate reality, a financially stable Canon group, being able to pull these resources together to make this trilogy. I think it'd be pretty cool. I mean, and then, of course, fast forward to, whenever the MCU comes around, I mean, yeah, you'd have better special effects and everything, and still some top-notch casting, but if the Canon group had been able, while maintaining financial stability, had been able to utilize these players, to make this particular, trilogy in the 80s, you would have had something that was very influential, because you would have something that, yes, it's a, set of comic book movies, but it's something that, adults could enjoy as well, because I don't think they'd want to do things like R-rated, because this is a comic book, character that, a lot of audiences really enjoy, whereas Conan the Barbarian, with respect to him, was more of for a select audience, like, I guess you could say, people, who like their things, darker and more violent. Captain America is someone who, was basically like a beacon in the darkness. Someone who, yes, I mean, he fought evil, fought crime, but he himself, did so in such a way to where, he made people want to, be better. Like, he inspired people. So it would be a trilogy that would show the darkness of war and human nature, as well, or I should say, the darkness of war and, corrupt government and what have you. But at the same time, there would be, something of hope in myth making, and this is where you'd have a comic book trilogy that would be grounded in harsh reality, and yet not without some imaginative flair, because you still have comic book characters in this movie, or some fantastical characters, especially in part 2 when the invaders are brought in. But yeah, that's just something I was kicking around, and I kind of did, what sort of was looking for an excuse to sort of come back to this alternate reality, canon group scenario. But I figured, well, hey, kill two birds with one stone. Same canon group, has a better working, collaboration with Toby Hooper, and makes a Captain America trilogy that rocks in the 80s. So there we go. And if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And you got any feedback, I'd love to hear it. And thanks for, being there and taking the time. And I hope you all have a good weekend. Y'all take care. Bye.